Right. Well, I wanted to start because you actually covered this earlier in the week for Unheard. You had a news bulletin piece out saying that he's declared war on the Tory press. I assume you're referring mainly to the Mail, and which is strange as well. The Telegraph. So they polled their readers, and even though they're known as the Tory Graph, it seems that the majority of their readers, the people who read the Telegraph, are voting for reform, which is quite amusing. What did you make of this whole Farage situation that's been confected by the establishment?
So my read on what's going on here is, well, foreign policy realism, which is what where Nigel Farage was coming from with those particular views, is extremely unfashionable in the mainstream press and institutional consensus as things stand. Liberal internationalism is where it's at. There is not a single realist foreign policy think tank in the United Kingdom, not one. There's no realist press. Realism is not given the time of day. But realism takes as its basic premise the idea that the international political situation is amoral and states act not according to some kind of abstract system of goals or international rules, but according to their own self-interest. And that this is just how things are, and what interests are and what spheres of interest are, and so on, is affected by your local geography and the relationships around you. And I mean, it's a complex and well trodden body of theory, but one that happens to be extremely out of favour with the current dominant consensus. That's where Nigel Farage was coming from. The frustrating thing for me about the Nick Robinson interview was that there was no space within that quickfire soundbite environment for any exploration of the different premises between Robinson and Farage, such as to be able to discuss the fact that Robinson was coming from the consensus liberal internationalist perspective, sorry, and Farage was coming from a completely different set of priors. However, what's interesting about it and what's relevant, I think, for your themes on Lotus Eaters is the way in which it's been seized upon by Farage's political opponents, who are many and various and have a number of different motivations. But it's been identified as a way to split the two sides of the Reform coalition, which, as you ably sketched out in your introduction just now, comprises a group of older, culturally conservative, perhaps less urban, broadly, I think, white British voters. But no, essentially the Brexit base, who embraced Nigel Farage in the Brexit Party, and then they've embraced Nigel Farage at the Reform Party. And this caucus leans older, they lean non-urban, and they form a significant proportion of the Reform base. The other half of the Reform base, as you also sketched out, is young, right-wing, predominantly male Zoomers, essentially. And these two groups have quite different perspectives, particularly where Russia is concerned, as has just been identified by the press. And the split, I think, is straightforwardly down to how old you were when the Berlin Wall fell. Now, I was 10 when the Cold War ended, the Berlin Wall came down. I vaguely remember it as, if this was a big thing that happened, and now half of my stamp collection, half of my German stamps in my stamp collection were no longer useful or relevant. That was the extent of my ruminations on the end of the Cold War. But for somebody 10 years older than me, you would have, an English person 10 years older than me, would have gone to school and would have been shown Threads, which is a movie. If you've never seen it, don't. It's an animated film which presents like a kids' film, but it's essentially a film about nuclear Armageddon. And a lot of kids saw this at school and were presented it as though it was a documentary, and are completely traumatized. And so let's say older Gen Xers would have spent their youth, their childhood, and teen years living as they thought under the threat of imminent nuclear destruction, which is viscerally associated in their minds with Russia. And this goes as well for generations older than that too. So if you say Russia to anyone from about maybe 5 to 10 years older than me, they're triggered at an absolutely visceral level in a way which simply stops being true for anyone who's under maybe about 35, because they literally weren't even born. Before they weren't even born when the Berlin Wall came down. So the Russia just doesn't exist as a boogeyman in the same way for them. And that's that. And not surprisingly, you can see that in the divergence of opinions where foreign policy is concerned. I linked a poll in the comment piece that I wrote on the Farage brouhaha. which showed that in the 18 to 34 cohort, really across both sides of the political spectrum, so we're not just talking about what you call reactionary Zoomers here, we're also talking about the leftists, the ones who turn out for Palestine. Really, for them, the foreign policy priorities do not lie anywhere near Russia. They're just not remotely interested. And I think this is very straightforwardly down to the fact that they were never traumatized by being shown Threads at school, and they weren't expecting to die horribly in the nuclear fallout. I mean, I know people who were told by their parents, as a child, if the bomb drops and we face the prospect of dying in a nuclear winter, I'll cut your throats and then kill myself. And could remember their mums saying that to them, and actually thought that this was a realistic prospect. Right, you raise an eyebrow, but this is a completely different reality, which is, and you can see how somebody could take very much more seriously in that context the threat of a resurgent Russia, because it just sets off sort of animal and a level of visceral fear which is inaccessible to somebody who doesn't remember the Cold War. And now this isn't really to take a stance on the threat or ambitions or political. This isn't really to take a stance on the geopolitical situation in Eastern Europe, which I'm just not qualified to comment on. But just for the avoidance of doubt, I don't really have a dog in this fight. But where it interests me is in thinking about the divergent political groups here, and what's inspiring the different and really obviously very strong feelings at work here. And just to complete the thought and bring it back to Mr. Farage, what's really salient about this from the point of view of his political project is that Ukraine is therefore an issue which splits his coalition, because the reactionary Zoomers, as you call them, don't give a stuff about Putin or care considerably less. Right? Putin may or may not be a threat, but we don't really have a view, and certainly we don't have a lizard brain reaction to the word Russia. But the older portion, the Brexit base portion of Farage's coalition, very much does, and I think this has been identified now very effectively as a way of undermining what has hitherto seemed like a fairly potent coalition, and they're just leaning into it because that's what you do in politics. It's an ugly business. You identify your enemy's weak spots, and then you hammer them. So, the polling looks as though it's flattened or possibly dipped for Farage over the last week, since that's been identified. And honestly, I mean, I live in small town England. It's the kind of thing that could potentially cut through. Most people don't care very much about politics on an everyday basis. But Nigel Farage seemed like a decent bloke, but he loves this guy who's been talked up since forever as an enemy of everything we like. Potentially, so that's the sort of thing which could travel into kind of passing conversation with people, and it could make a difference. I don't know, but yeah, I think it's been thanks to that structural generational difference in perspective on Russia, it's been identified as a weak spot, and who knows, it could have a significant impact. Speaking personally, I think he was very foolish to be realist on Maine, because it's just I think it was an unwise decision. Foreign policy realism is not a set of outlooks that ever looks good. You're always going to look like a sociopath. If you even if actually what you're saying is basically correct, it's always going to make you look like a sociopath. And the liberal internationalist who talks about big ideals is always going to look like the good guy, even if actually what they're proposing is not even remotely workable.
That's funny though, because so to chime in slightly, the frame of reference is really poignant, because for me, all of these atomic anxieties. So one of the main things that I did when I was an undergrad, I've always been a comics addict, is went back and looked through what America was exporting around the world in their popular entertainment at the time. And it was always the long nuclear shadow that was coinciding with the resurrected Nazi threat and things like Batman and Green Lantern, Green Arrow and Swamp Thing. But there was also always the creation of superheroes and supervillains from the atomic bomb. Everything was compared to the massive mushroom cloud. It's in all Japanese manga, for example. And so they all seem like artifacts to me, whereas someone who was born not even having 9/11 in living memory, and who's looked at the liberal international order, who have spent all their credibility on the invasion of Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, etc., I think young people look at that and go, the post-war and post-Cold War liberal international order doesn't rest like a dead hand on my conscience. And I'm also sourcing my news from non-mainstream outlets, for example, like the Daily Mail, who Farage has found misrepresented this anonymous source from within Zelensky's government as saying that Farage himself has given credibility to the Kremlin when no such thing happened. Instead, they're looking at whatever war, be it Israel-Palestine or Russia-Ukraine, from different angles. and they don't have all those priors, and instead they're seeing their own governments as no more credible than Vladimir Putin himself because they've done the illegal invasions under the Uniparty. And so I see all that and think, I don't think it's going to damage the Zoomers, as we said. And those polls where it looks like he's taken a dip, I'm going to mention this later after I have to let you get on with more fun things and chatting to me. But that poll where people have been saying, oh, it looks like he's reform have lost results, it was funded by Rory Stewart and Alistair Campbell. And something smells about that, particularly when their other poll was that GB News viewers are voting overwhelmingly for Labour. And it's like...
Alistair, 45 minutes Campbell, yes.
Yeah, Alistair, I was exonerated 6 times for the dodgy dossier, even though there are no weapons of mass destruction. Campbell, yes, quite, yeah.
I'm concerned about the normalisation of lies in politics. Campbell, yes.
Yeah, that guy, Mr. Alistair. Okay. I'm a spin doctor. Campbell, yeah, sure.
Yes,
literally spin doctor.
But I think we'll see, but there's not very long till the polls, and I know. Like when the whole Ukraine thing started, there were people 10 years older than me who looked at the headlines and freaked out and were straight down stockpiling tins and water in the cellar. And I was watching them and thinking, okay, you're freaking out, and I can see that you're really, maybe I should be concerned, but I'm not feeling it. And maybe that's just because to me it was the end of a stamp collection, and to them it was potentially the end of the world. So the prospect of war with Russia just hits different, I think, if you're an older Xer plus. So whether it'll all roll. I mean, Farage is famously Teflon, but we'll see if this one rolls off him. I think it's there's some days left, and he could find some more. He could find another rack of melons, and it could all be fine again. Who knows?
Yeah, well, speaking of his sort of impenetrable demeanour, one of the other interesting things that I found that you wrote during the course of this is that he's bringing back a sort of medieval patronage style politics, and the sort of dichotomy that was set up here. And I'll get into the Kipling Saxon poem in a minute because I think it's very interesting framing. There's the giggle, but it's that very much the technocrats are on one side, and the complexity of modern governance, of technology, of international relations and obligations almost necessitates the technocrat class, even if you want to repeal some of the technocracy. Whereas, is Farage enough of the moniker that was actually given to Liz Truss, a sort of a human hand grenade, a wrecking ball to this, that can adequately take it on? And does reform require not being a traditional political party, but rather a kind of fiefdom for him to manifest enough executive power to get that done? Am I sort of right in summing up your perspective there?
More or less, yeah. I mean, really, the ideas that I'm exploring here, and this is an ongoing line of thought for me. So this is by no means I haven't concluded my thoughts on this at all. It's a kind of recurring series, I suppose. I'm very grateful to have an editor who lets me write sort of long form series but this one's really about what if mass democracy is actually already over. Which is a possibility that I consider on the regular. What if in fact that's just a done deal already? And I mean, and Farage as a figure interests me in that context because he was so instrumental in Brexit, which seemed for a moment as though it might be a reversal of what had seemed up to that point for me as sort of ineluctable drift away from politicians accountable to their electorates towards something very post-democratic, where there's a nexus of supranational institutions which works in concert with an equally unaccountable and unelected nexus of often supranational and shadily funded NGOs, and serves as a kind of impenetrable force for laundering each other's opinions, such that civil society consensus never really has to pay much attention to the views of the electorate at all. I mean, this is a situation which a number of people have commented on in different ways, and it was, and my interest really in the Brexit campaign was as meaningful pushback to that. And for a moment, it seemed as though it might actually work, and it was shocking, and I was dismayed to witness the aftermath, the institutional screeching that followed the vote. and the very serious institutional efforts to resist having to implement what had been voted on. And then what happened when they actually did implement what had been voted on, which was that people implemented it and then quietly went on not doing the things that the vote had been the vote had been cast for, fundamentally. And this has led me to the conclusion that perhaps, I mean, my personal reason for supporting Brexit was because I thought there was a fighting chance that the British institutional capacity had not been so chronically decayed already that we might be able to recoup some kind of function as an independent sovereign state. And I thought it was worth a shot, even though it was pretty late in the day. I no longer think that. I think we've tried it. I mean, it's been what, nearly 5 years. Even since we got Brexit done, it's been the best part of 10 since the vote, and I no longer think that we have any kind of a fighting chance at recouping the functions of a sovereign state on the certainly on the pre-war model, which I think, I mean, there's a whole rabbit hole. We're not going to have a chance to go down there. And honestly, if there was a meaningful prospect of rejoining the European Union right now, I wouldn't object, because at this point, I don't think
That's funny
we're
because
we're
Harrison
meaningfully
said the
separable
same
from it.
thing.
Yeah, and I don't think I'm the only one. I mean, that's probably possibly a kind of man bites dog. Given some of my previous publication, but at the moment I'm honestly of the view that it just wouldn't make very much difference either way, and in a lot of ways it would make life easier for the kind of small businesses which have been really shafted since we left. Yeah. There are a lot of pros and cons, but on the issues that the great mass of people voted to Brexit for, it wouldn't make any difference at all. If anything, it would improve things from where we are right now. So when I write about, and really one of the reflections that spun off from this, which I discussed in the piece that you just referenced, was the very serious possibility that in fact elected non-specialists simply don't have the bandwidth to get their head round enough of the complexities involved in policy decision making for a high-tech 21st century state, and that in fact the way a huge amount of the business of governing has been hived off to technocrats is just a pragmatic response to the fact that the international regulatory environment, for example, is so convoluted now that the second and third order consequences of things take seriously nerdy specialists to calculate, and simply doing it on the back of a fag packet based on what the people of your constituency think just isn't good enough. That's a very serious possibility, and I think that's really what the Remainers were saying. That was precisely what the Remainers were saying. And there are a lot of people who just really didn't want it to be true, including me. I really didn't want it to be true that in fact technocrats, it's either technocrats or second and third order regulatory cock-ups, left, right, and centre. You're continuing that line of thought. I was thinking, well, okay, so if technocracy is unavoidable, that still leaves a problem, which is the structural the fact that technocracies by design are insulated from popular opinion. That's the whole point of them. You can't technocrat unless you're relatively shielded from what the man in the street thinks, because the whole point of you is that you're supposed to be able to take objective, rational, spreadsheet and chino wearing type decisions in a safe environment, based on facts and evidence and blah blah blah. That's the whole point of them. But there's also then that raises the very real possibility, extremely real, as the technocrats are beginning to discover, that sometimes those spreadsheet based decisions can have human consequences, which you wouldn't have calculated simply because, for example, you live in pleasant bits of London and don't get to see the knock on effects of your decisions in say a post industrial town somewhere in the northwest. Or whatever it happens to be. There are everybody exists in a filter bubble, and so there needs to be some kind of a feedback mechanism from the population at large. And this is a reality in any functioning system, even where it's not democratic. That unless there's some kind of a feedback mechanism for other interested stakeholders in the entire body of state to make their views known in aggregate to the governing body, whether it's democratic or not, unless those feedback mechanisms are in place. Eventually, some group or other is going to get pissed off enough that they're going to cause serious trouble, and then you've got internal unrest on your hands, and then you have a whole new set of problems. So functioning states, whether they're democratic or autocratic or technocratic, indeed, need some feedback mechanism, and currently we don't have it. And I think this is one of the most, let's say we are just now, we've abandoned mass democracy as a failed experiment because reasons. Let's say, hypothetically speaking, let's say that's already happened. And let's say technocracy is actually the least worst of all the variously terrible ways that we could be governing a high-tech 21st century state. One of the questions that I think about a lot at the moment, and I don't really have a completely worked out answer to, is what possible means is there now for the post-industrial proletariat? What levers remain for the post-industrial proletariat to make their views not just known but felt among the governing classes? Because the point, I mean, mass democracy only really happened because the ship of state in aggregate needed the working classes. I mean, the working classes were just ignored for centuries, if not millennia, because nobody cared what they thought because they didn't have to. You only really cared what the peasants thought when you either needed to tax them more or to arm them and send them to war. Apart from that, everyone just left them to get on with it. And the only reason the working classes ever got the vote was in the aftermath of World War One, where it became where the total mobilization for total war resulted in the sort of coming to consciousness of Britain to itself as a sort of mass industrialized collective. And that was, and at that point, it came to seem morally indefensible not to give every adult the vote. And so that's the point where all working adults over the age of 18, I think by the end of the 1920s, were granted the vote. And I don't think it's a coincidence that that's also the point where the NGocracy began to take shape, because at that point the technocrats, which is to say the people who govern things, just didn't really want to be very electorally accountable, and so mechanisms began to coalesce simultaneously with the arrival of the universal franchise for doing an end run around the views of the masses. I mean, ruling class is going to ruling class, I guess. And so, but anyway, sort of fast forward on a century from there, and we've arrived at a point where that NGocracy and those sort of supranational institutions which began to form concurrently with the universal franchise have now developed to the point, even simultaneously with the disempowering, the material and political defanging of the industrial working class through globalization, such that the enfranchisement of the working class just wouldn't happen now. If the plebs in England didn't have a vote at this point, they would have no leverage for acquiring one. If you see what I mean, because there just is, we don't have an industrial base anymore. So like, what are they for? From a sort of spreadsheets and chinos guy's perspective, like, who cares what they think? But to be clear, I don't endorse any of this, but this is, I think none of this gives me great pleasure to report, but this is the situation as I see it, I guess.
Yeah, it's a sober analysis. Yep.
Yeah, it's not a very happy one, but I think that's where we are. So the question for me, so at the end of that, it's a multiple paragraph. Is not exactly a digression, but an explanation of what it is that I'm thinking through. The question for me, what levers are there actually available for the masses? And this is where I think Nigel Farage is such an interesting figure, an ambivalent one. I don't think this is the final Pokemon evolution of representation in the form I'm talking about, but I think it's a step on the way. But I think what we're seeing is the return of a much older form of representation that we haven't really seen since the Middle Ages, and not representation as in one man, one vote, which was what we had during the franchise era. Or at least that's what it culminated in. But the idea of different parts of the body politic being, as it were, represented to the decision-making powers, which is a very much older and much more medieval way of thinking about it, where you might think of the body politic as literally a body, with hands and a head and a heart And to think, well, we can take a subset of each of the different interests, which might in the Middle Ages, for example, have been the priest class. The landowners would have been considered an interest in their own right. The peasants would have been considered an interest in their own right. We could probably do. We could probably do a modern day equivalent of that typology. I mean, I'm not gonna try and spitball that, but I think that's a fairly straightforward.
Thank you for watching that clip from Tomlinson Talks. If you liked that and you would like to see more, you can get the full 90-minute show every week on a Wednesday afternoon, live from 3 p.m., only on lotuseaters.com, and all of the other content that my colleagues produce behind the paywall for as little as £5 a month. Thank you very much for supporting us, and I hope to see you there. Until next time, goodbye.